There is a formula that most animated films follow when they need to handle grief. Usually, in the first act of the movie, something terrible happens. The main characters in these films show approximately 45 seconds of visible sadness, and then the story moves on. For example, in The Lion King, Simba watches his father fall into a wildebeest stampede, but after his father passes away, Simba runs and spends the next few years in exile, but those years are portrayed as carefree. I could say he was having the time of his life. The grief of Mufasa's passing does not follow him into the jungle. Timon and Pumbaa teach him to forget his past completely. The loss of Mufasa didn't really affect his formative years. Or what about Bambi? After his mom got gunned down and his father told him that his mother was gone, he shed a tear and that was it. A tear and a sad backward glance, that's all his mom got. Then spring comes, he is older, and the film moves on. Just like in Lion King, the loss serves as an ignition, the catalyst to get the protagonist to the next stage. The grief they experience is brief. It is used as a plot mechanism, but Pixar treats grief differently. It sees it as a condition, and that single distinction is why Pixar films land differently. The Pixar films we are going to examine do not all handle grief the same way. Let's start with the most recognizable kind of grief, the kind everybody eventually encounters, the grief of losing a loved one. Up is the best example of this. In the first few minutes of the film, we watch an entire marriage from the happy beginning to its quiet end. We watch two people fall in love, build a life, face disappointment, console each other, grow old, and then we watch one of them die. The scenes after her passing show the grief that Carl carries deeply. He never gets over Ellie. The entire film is built around his refusal to move forward. His house is no longer just a house. Every piece of furniture, every corner of every room carries a presence. His grief was so strong that he even did something really crazy. Only grief and heartbreak would have made him tie 10,000 balloons to the roof of their home and drag it into the sky. He's now chasing their dream because he cannot bear to leave her behind. Coco treats grief differently. Where Up is about dealing with the loss privately, Coco is about what happens when loss becomes collective. What happens when a family and a culture are dealing with loss? The film is set against the backdrop of Dia de los Muertos, the Mexican tradition of remembering the dead. In Coco, the dead are not simply gone, they are in the land of the dead.
Welcome back to the land of the dead.
And they can only stay there as long as the living remember them. Coco introduces the concept of second death. The first death is physical, the second death is permanent. In Coco, when you experience grief for someone you love who has died, you remember them and in the process, you keep them alive. Showing that grief means the person existed, mattered, and will not be erased. So in Coco, grief doesn't need to be sad in the way that most animated death scenes are sad. It is bittersweet because love and loss have become completely inseparable. Onward takes a totally different approach. Ian Lightfoot has never met his father. His father died before Ian was old enough to form any memory of him. What Ian carries is not grief in the conventional sense. He does not feel the ache of losing the presence of someone he loves. He feels something harder to name. He's mourning a relationship that never existed, but he desperately wants.
I wish I'd met him.
This is the kind of loss that most stories do not know how to address. There's no before to contrast with the after. Ian has his father's van, his father's spellbook, and his father's recorded voice on a cassette tape. What he has is an outline of a person. He can only create a mental picture. Throughout the film, his one goal is to get a spell to bring his father back, even if for only one day. At the end of the film, though, Ian does something surprising. He sacrifices his chance to say goodbye to his father so that his brother can have it instead. Throughout the film, Ian grieves the father he never had, but in the end, he chooses his brother over his grief. During their journey, Ian has processed his grief and has healed. He has concluded that the love he was grieving was already standing next to him the whole time. He learns the value of what remains. Grief does not only come in the form of someone else's absence. Sometimes it comes from within, from the experience of losing yourself or a version of yourself or the certainty you once had about who you were and what you felt. Inside Out is, on its surface, a film about a girl who moves to a new city and struggles to adjust. Riley is not just sad, Riley is grieving. She's grieving her old life, her old friendships. She misses her old home. The grief she feels wreck her entire emotional system. For most of the film, Joy treats sadness as a problem. Joy wants sadness away from the control panel so she doesn't contaminate Riley's emotions with her presence. Joy is like every well-meaning person who has ever told someone grieving that they need to cheer up and that things could be worse. By the end of the movie, we see that Joy is wrong. Not because being positive is bad, but because sadness is not the enemy of happiness. It's a necessary companion. Inside Out 2 picks up where the first film left off, but the grief it is examining has shifted. Riley is no longer mourning her old life. She is mourning her old self. She's going through puberty and is anxious that the person she is becoming might not be someone she recognizes or likes or even wants to be. Anxiety takes over the control panel and begins dismantling Riley's sense of self in the name of protecting her future. But you see, anxiety's mistake is thinking that the solution is to build a newer, tougher version of Riley from scratch. That she has to replace the old her with someone more prepared, more guarded, more ready for whatever adolescence is about to throw at her. But that is not how grief works. You do not get through it by becoming a different person. You get through it by making room for all the parts of yourself that now have to exist alongside each other. The confident parts and the frightened parts, the old Riley and the new one. The film ends with Riley accepting that she is allowed to be complicated. For a film aimed at teenagers, that is a remarkably honest thing to say. There is another type of grief where you are not mourning somebody. This is the grief of time itself, of phases of life that end. This is the type of grief that lives inside the Toy Story films. When Andy drives away to college and then Woody watches him go, you're not just watching a toy lose its owner, you're also watching a childhood end. The toys are Andy's childhood physically represented, but now they are sitting in boxes because he no longer needs them. His playroom is now empty, and Woody, who has been with Andy since he was a small boy, has to deal with his new reality. The toys had already been grieving long before now. They grieved when Andy stopped coming to play. They grieved when they thought he had thrown them away. Every scene at Sunnyside Daycare is them trying to rebuild a life now that the original one is gone. They're trying to find a new place to belong because the place they belong to has moved on without them. In Soul, Joe Gardner experiences another type of grief. Grieving the life you imagined for yourself but you never had a chance to live. Or when you mourn a future that closes before you reach it. Soul opens with Joe on what should be the best day of his life. Joe is a middle school music teacher who has spent decades believing that his real life, his actual life, the one that matters, has not yet begun. He believes that one day he will be a successful jazz musician. One day, he gets the call from a famous musician. He lands the gig that was supposed to change everything and then falls into a manhole and dies. The film is asking a question. What if the life you spent your whole existence postponing was the life you were already living. After passing away, Joe journeys through the great before and the great beyond. He meets 22, a soul who has spent millennia resisting the spark that will send her to Earth. She's convinced that human life has nothing worth experiencing. What changes her mind eventually is not some grand experience.
What?
You're in my body!
You're in the
that's
cat?
my body!
I'm in a body?
What?
It is leaves twirling in the wind, a slice of pizza, the feeling of sunlight, the smallest, most ordinary textures of being alive. Joe, watching this, begins to understand what his grief over his unlived career has actually cost him. It cost him the life he had. He never properly lived because he was too busy waiting for the real one to start. The film ends with Joe realizing that he doesn't need to be a famous musician to be happy. He decides he simply wants to live, to just be present and enjoy whatever time he has left. The thing about grief is that it doesn't really end. What changes is not the grief itself, but the person's relationship to it. Carl learns to carry Ellie as a companion in his heart. Miguel learns that remembering is an act of love, not just mourning. Woody learns that identity can survive even if you lose your original purpose. These are not the same as being healed. You either choose to be consumed by grief or shaped by it. Many people will look at Pixar's catalog and see children's cartoons, but spend enough time with them. Really spend time with them and you will see that these films know things, not just about adventure or friendship or following your dreams. They know a lot about grief. This is why many adults go back to these movies. Pixar never made these films just for kids. The films are for everyone who has ever lost something real, which is eventually all of us. If you enjoyed this video, like, comment and subscribe. See you in the next one.